Hello, my name is Frances Widdowson, and for people who don't know me, I was a tenured professor at Mount Royal University, and I was wrongfully terminated in December 2021. And one of the reasons why I was terminated was because I was challenging the existing position on the residential schools being genocidal, and this was upsetting to a number of Indigenous scholar activists at Mount Royal University. So I've been involved in studying the residential schools since 2016, and things became more and more difficult to be examining this area until 2021, when eventually it became impossible for me to try to put forward arguments which a number of Indigenous scholar activists and their allies did not like, and they claimed that this made them feel unsafe to be having these arguments being put forward. So this issue is very, very significant in Canada, and there have been peaks and valleys with respect to what's been happening. And recently, things are starting to heat up again on this file because James Heller, who's a lawyer in Victoria, he tried to change some training materials to have them reflect reality. So instead of having the training materials say graves had been found at the what was the Kamloops Indian Residential School in the old apple orchard, he just requested that these materials be changed to potential graves, which was actually the view of a Supreme Court judge in British Columbia, who in a decision that he wrote said that another judge was correct when she said there were potential graves and not actual graves there. So there's a lot of precedent for having this accurate position asserted. The Law Society, when Heller tried to do this, they put out a press release which was basically supporting other comments that Heller and his co-mover of a resolution were engaged in racism and discrimination. And now Heller is suing the Law Society. And this didn't end there. We then had Dallas Brodie, who is an MLA and shadow critic, I think it's called, for the Attorney General position. So she's in opposition. She was making a comment that this was outrageous that the Law Society was doing this, and that 0 graves had been found in Kamloops. As a result of that, there was a whole bunch of reaction to that. And so now we are going to be having an event this Sunday on this whole controversy that has erupted. And what I wanted to do was just share with you the materials that I have compiled on the wokeacademy.info website. So what I would like to do is just share my screen to go into the wokeacademy.info site and show you this post that I've done. So this is the wokeacademy.info site. You'll see there's a whole bunch of materials about my case on there, but there's a number of posts which are put on the site relatively frequently. And the latest one is James Heller, Dallas Brodie, and the Law Society of British Columbia. And so what I want to do is just go into this post and show you the materials that I have compiled to give you a sense of the nature of this controversy. I begin this post with something that I was able to extract from a comment that Sean Carleton made recently about the Kamloops case on CBC. And this is an actual quote from Carleton stating, if they can delegitimize Kamloops, then they can delegitimize the entire residential school narrative. And Carleton is a professor at the University of Manitoba, but he is also a self-proclaimed expert in what the phrase that he has coined himself, residential school denialism. And this is an absurd thing for Sean Carleton to claim, because the term residential school denialism doesn't make any sense at all. No one is denying the existence of the residential schools, the harm that the residential schools caused, and many would argue that the residential schools weren't even well-intentioned. What we are mostly taking issue with, the people who are called residential school denialists, is the claim of clandestine burials, and also the claim that the residential schools were genocidal. So these are legitimate positions based in evidence, reason, and logic. And for Sean Carleton to be making all these accusations and implying that people who are having good faith discussions about what actually happened historically in the residential schools, that they are similar to Holocaust deniers, is outrageous and should be made fun of. Because, as I have called him many times, he is an uber clown, and I can't stop calling him that because he just, every time you turn around, he just cannot stop engaging in this clownery, which is not what an academic should be engaged in. So he really can't be taken seriously. So what I've done in this post is I have kind of given a rough outline as to what has happened with respect to this particular controversy. And it started on July 26, 2024. So that's about, 6 months ago. And Heller contacted the Law Society when he saw this comment in the training materials with the Law Society. And what was said in these training materials was that the discovery of an unmarked burial site containing the bodies of 215 children on the former Kamloops Indian Residential School grounds. And as well, that the discovery confirms what survivors have been saying all along. So the discovery was anomalies on the ground penetrating radar, as we found out with the Pine Creek excavations, where they believed that anomalies in a church basement were burials. They excavated that site and just found rocks as to what these anomalies were. So this could be the same situation in the Kamloops case. And a number of people, Camraz on his website, Graves in the Apple Orchard, has documented that there are a huge amount of septic tiles that were laid in the 1920s in an east-west configuration where the GPR found the anomalies, so it's highly likely that those anomalies are the septic tiles. Anyway, Heller responded to this claim by pointing out this court case, Chief Justice Len Marchand, who agreed with the way to describe this as potential unmarked burials. And you can go and look at that decision if you just click on the here hyperlink. Anyway, so he continued to follow up with the Law Society. I believe he followed up a couple of times, and he kept on stating that it's very important to get these training materials right, because we currently have the special interlocutor for unmarked graves who is suggesting that what's called residential school denialism should be made illegal. So if we do not correct the facts on this matter in these training materials, it could give momentum to people making accusations of residential school denialism and potentially having those people being criminally charged and incarcerated. So it's not just a trivial matter. It's very, very important. And he's trying to explain this to the Law Society. This request to change those materials was ignored, which resulted in Jim Heller and Mark Berry putting forward a resolution for the Law Society's annual general meeting, and you can take a look at that resolution. All you do is you click on the chevrons, and that will enable you to open that. I'm just trying to get see if I can get that. I don't want to waste time on that, but you'll be able to take a look at that if you want to get into that document. But I've just summarized the important part, which was that the discovery of an unmarked burial site containing the bodies of 215 children. Jim Heller suggested that it should be replaced with the discovery of a potential unmarked burial site. That was the resolution that was put forth by Heller and his colleague Barry. When they did this, it was unbelievable, the response from a number of lawyers who attacked Heller and Barry. And this resulted in a press release being issued by the BC First Nations Justice Council, which accused them of residential school denialism and engaging in racism and discrimination for putting forward this resolution, which was simply to correct factually incorrect materials that the Law Society was mandating that all these lawyers should be reading. Heller and Barry were not making comments at all about anything to do with the residential school system. So it just shows you how tenacious many of these people who are trying to paint a particular picture of the residential schools are. And going back to Sean Carleton's comment, which I believe is quite insightful, probably unintentionally so, that it's deep down realized that because of all the hysteria that happened in 2021 because of the Kamloops case, if people start to doubt that, then they will start to question other claims that are being put forward by Carleton and all the various other people who are driving this agenda. And I should mention, extracting funding on this basis. We have $320 or $330 million being extracted. We had the Kamloops Band who made an application for excavations, a $9.3 million application. They got $12.1 million and have not done any excavations with respect to that site. So this is very significant. And many would say that because they got the $9.3 million for excavations and they haven't done any, that constitutes fraud. And there should be an audit done on that situation. Anyway, so that's the press release from this British Columbia First Nations Justice Council. This is an embarrassment that they would be putting this out, this quite a defamatory kind of document on in response to Heller and Barry. And then even worse, because that other one was obviously an Indigenous advocacy organization, and we kind of expect behavior like that from those types of organizations. What we have is a response from the Law Society of British Columbia. And it's these kinds of actions by the Law Society that is resulting in James Heller pursuing this lawsuit. And you can read this September 10th, 2024 press release, and they refer to that BC First Nations Justice Council release where Heller and Barry are accused of racism and discrimination for just wanting to correct information which is factually inaccurate. And they close this off by saying the resolution submitted by Mr. Heller and Mr. Barry only highlights the need to increase knowledge and understanding and continue our efforts of advancing meaningful reconciliation with Indigenous people and eliminate racism in our profession. So they're implying that this motion was driven by some kind of racist impulse. Then we have the notice of claim, which you can take a look at. Supreme Court of British Columbia, James Heller against the Law Society of British Columbia, and you can take a look at the various elements of Jim Heller's claim, and they're waiting for a response from the Law Society of British Columbia. There has been no response yet. It should be coming within the next week or so. So that's kind of the backdrop of what happened with respect to James Heller's lawsuit against the Law Society of British Columbia. When this occurred, when it became known that James Heller was putting forward this lawsuit, this is when Dallas Brodie became involved, and Dallas Brodie is the MLA for Vancouver Kilchena. I'm not sure exactly how that's pronounced. And not only is Dallas Brodie an MLA for the Conservatives, she is also Attorney General critic. And so that's what led her to say that she needs to act, and she needs to engage the minister and Attorney General, Minister Sharma, and the Law Society over this mistreatment of the lawyers who were requesting changes. So this seems like a rational position to take. The Law Society seems to be acting in a very authoritarian manner. They need to be held to account. She's worried about this because she's saying that the truth is very important in the law. If you aren't able to establish facts, you can have people being wrongfully imprisoned. And so to have the Law Society taking such a cavalier approach to the truth, this doesn't bode well for the future. Anyway, what happened in response to these tweets is just quite astonishing, because we have Christine Boyle, who is the BC Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, which called these tweets abhorrent behavior and residential school denials, just saying that she is upset about how these lawyers have been treated and she is going to pursue this. At the same time, we have obviously a massive blow up on social media, especially on what used to be called Twitter. And we have on the one side, people telling Brodie that she should be charged with a hate crime. Shall we dig up your family members to confirm they're dead? And I just wanted to stop briefly to look at this, because I've seen this kind of argument made a number of times. We have to determine whether there are bodies in the old apple orchard in Kamloops. There's no evidence of any bodies, and this is not what the kind of arguments that Heller and Barry are making, or even Brodie is making, but I'm making them, is that it is highly improbable that there are bodies there, because first of all, that's a lot of remains that have to be buried there. And the fact that no one sort of noticed at the time, no teachers, there are 3 Indigenous teachers at the residential schools. They never said anything. One of those teachers, Michelle, last name Michelle, Joe Michelle, I believe, he was the chief of a band in Chase. No parent has said that their children went missing from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So this doesn't make any sense. Anyway, he's calling whoever this person is, calling Brodie a repugnant piece of garbage and so on. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff. And we're not talking about digging up family members. We're saying people are alleging there's a crime scene. You don't just say, oh, well, we're not going to look at this. We're not going to investigate, when you're kind of making allegations about murder and a whole bunch of remains of children being buried clandestinely. So these arguments about, digging up your family members, cut it out. There are no family members are likely to be there, and you're making allegations of a criminal nature. This would not be tolerated in any other context. Then we have on the other side people who are supporting Dallas Brodie, and this is a particularly interesting one because it screen captures this Graves in the Apple Orchard type of discussion that's going on by CamRes, and you can see there with those red lines, that's where the septic tiles are. So this is the evidence that we have that it's, those are probably what those anomalies were that Sarah Bolio found on her GPR machine. And we don't have Sarah Bolio's report because it's being hidden, and we need that report too. So there's a lot of lack of transparency that exists about this case. So those are kind of a lot of chatter that's going on of various people supporting or opposing Brodie. And then as a result of this big, huge blow up, we have the conservatives, some of the conservative MLAs become involved. And our Warbus, Alia Warbus, who is an MLA, a conservative MLA, she has the nerve to say, inform yourself in response to Brodie's post, inform yourself, get the latest facts, research, and talk to survivors. The latest facts are that there are no remains found, and people are saying there are remains found, and we're trying to correct the record so we can have a factually accurate type of understanding of what's happening. And then this idea of talking to survivors, this is from, over 50 years ago. Memories are notoriously unreliable. And we have survivors like Billy Coombs who were saying that, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip came to Kamloops and abducted 10 children from the Kamloops Indian residential schools. What do people say about that? The Queen wasn't even in Kamloops that year. And even if she were in Kamloops, the Queen is followed around by, tons of reporters. How would she have been able to abduct 10 children? Billy Coombs was a survivor. Should everyone have believed Billy Coombs when he's saying that? This is the same kind of thing. You can't just believe survivors, because survivors' memories can be unreliable, and we need to have other evidence to be able to ascertain whether they are correctly remembering things, especially with respect to the hysteria that happened in 2021. We only had 2 eyewitness accounts, Billy Coombs and Jesse Jules, and they were related to the United Church, defrocked United Church minister Kevin Annett, who had all sorts of improbable claims about torture chambers in the basements of residential schools. It's just not a credible kind of area of information. And what happened is, when we had this announcement made in 2021 by the Kamloops Band, which falsely claimed that the remains of 215 children had been found, this was when all these memories started to surface about this matter. So that Warbus here, MLA Warbus, has a lot of nerve saying get the latest facts. He wouldn't know a fact if it hit her in the face. And then even more bizarre, Warbus says, physical evidence is one aspect you can hyper focus on. And yes, you will be called a denier. So those of us who are insisting on physical evidence to claim the existence of remains, we're going to be called deniers. So this is just basic scientific research that if we had engaged in this more, we wouldn't be in the same position that we are right now. And that's a conservative MLA. It's shocking. Then we have Nikki Ashton, who's a NDP MP, so federally, saying that Brodie is denying the atrocities in residential schools ever happened. This is incredibly irresponsible and probably defamatory, because that's not what Brodie said at all. Brodie is talking about the specific case of Kamloops, and everything that Brodie has said is true, that we do not have any evidence of remains. So just knock it off. Stop it. This is really irresponsible. And then, of course, the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs gets involved and puts out a press release accusing Brodie of racist residential school denialism and asking her to apologize to survivors. This is outrageous and should be, pushed back against hard. This group is just been doing this kind of thing for the last 4 years. And of course, this is what I called In Separate But Unequal, which is a book that was written in 2019, which is the academic argument, neo-tribal renterism. They extract millions of dollars in funds, and as well, the book Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry looks at this situation as well. The lawyers, the consultants, and these neo-tribal elites are all involved. And the saying that there was 215 bodies in Kamloops really greased the machinery to extract more funds, and a whole bunch of other issues also got pushed forward at that time. So that's their press release, which is just outrageous. And then, to put the icing on the cake, we have John Rustad, who is the Conservative Party leader. And I find this hard to believe that he goes to a press conference, and you can look at the link, watch the press conference, or you can look at the transcript that I prepared when I was watching this press conference. And Rustad says all sorts of false claims in this press conference. I don't understand how the leader of a political party can be so either woefully ignorant or incredibly opportunistic, or both, to make statements such as 4,000 children did not return home. This is not correct at all. There, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have confirmed deaths of, I believe it's 453, it might be 423 children. The 4,000 number comes from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. They had this banner, and they added a whole bunch of names of people who didn't even go to the residential school. What the most notable being Helen Betty Osborne, who tragically was murdered by a bunch of men, but she was walking to another school. She wasn't going to a residential school, so it had nothing to do with residential schools. That's just kind of one example. The cemeteries, many of these cemeteries served northern communities. In the early days of residential schools, you can understand why it wouldn't have been possible to return bodies to communities, but that was in the early years. In the later years, bodies were returned and buried in the home cemeteries. This is a massive area of research which Rustad doesn't know anything about, and the fact that he's saying these things, it's probably just pandering to these Indigenous activists, but I'm not quite sure why he would do something so foolish, and throwing his MLA under the bus as well. Shame on you. That is something to be just totally, people should take him to task for that. And then we have again the Minister of Indigenous Relations again, celebrating the fact that Peter Milobar, who is also a Conservative MLA, who's connected to the Indigenous community, and here's a transcript of his statements that he made about how he's got to push back on residential school denialism. The fact that these people are going after Brodie, MLA Brodie, one of their colleagues, for just trying to correct factually incorrect information and to stop the Law Society, or not stop them, but question the Law Society for its oppressive actions towards James Heller, it's really unbelievable. And that's a colleague of Brodie's. So this just shows you how seriously problematic the whole area of discussing the residential schools is. And I know something about this, as I mentioned, because I was in the university system from, beginning in 2000s to 2021 when I was fired. And this was a very, very difficult area to study. And you got many, many professors who were attacking you. And there's a lot of intimidation, just to be frank. And Rodney Clifton and Jaime Rubenstein, when they tried to just sound the alarm about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report having a lot of flaws, they were attacked. I think about over 50 colleagues signed some open letter condemning them. I had a lot of problems at Mount Royal University. They became worse and worse and worse. And Sean Carleton was at Mount Royal University until June 2020. So he was part of the climate that resulted in me being pushed out of Mount Royal University. And Carleton has become the worst figure academically with respect to these kinds of smears which are occurring. And of course, he's at it again. So most people have backed away from this now, most of these academics, because they sense that the Kamloops case is not going to, it's not going to be supported, the existence of remains. But Carleton just can't help it because he's such an uber clown. He just keeps on going back in there. And this is just a sample of what he's doing here. And he's going after Brodie. He's supporting this outrageous press release by the Union of British Columbia of Indian Chiefs. He is talking about deliberate obfuscation, like he should talk, and residential school denialism. Keeps on going at this. And then this is when he's talking to the CBC, he says something quite insightful, which I snipped out of there and put into the beginning comment. If they can delegitimize Kamloops, then they can delegitimize the entire residential school narrative. And that makes sense why people are fighting so hard about trying to correct the record, because really it all goes back to Kamloops. That if we hadn't had that announcement by the Kamloops band, we wouldn't have had such a hysterical reaction, and there wouldn't have been all these parts start to move in terms of even things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That gave that fuel to go forward, which now there are huge problems. And then we have Megan Murphy, who's just, talking about the fact there are no graves, and he's accusing her of being a failed journalist who's now a cheerleader for residential school denialism. He does these memes, which are just outrageous. If you say facts matter and no bodies have been found, this means that you are a Trojan horse for anti-Indigenous racism. And then he has their investigations are ongoing, 4,000 plus deaths at the eye. That's not true. So he is putting forward factually incorrect information. The deaths at KIRS, we have information that Nina Green and Jacques Rillard have put forward, which I've talked about earlier. And I believe it is almost 40 of the death certificates have been acquired. They were not murdered. These are children who died from things like, tuberculosis, accidents, and so on. They were buried in their home cemeteries. So this has nothing to do with these claims about the clandestine burials. And then right-wing extremism. So for people who want to know my politics, I am a socialist who was a follower of George Orwell, and I am an atheist, so I have no connections to many of the kind of conservative movement. However, I'm trying to form alliances with people who want to have open inquiry about a number of issues. And so I'm perfectly willing to sit down with anyone who thinks that there's growing authoritarianism. And then, this is the final thing that Sean Carleton is, friends don't let friends do residential school denialism. Anyway, that gives you a bit of a sense of the whole controversy surrounding James Heller's struggles with the Law Society, attempts by Dallas Brodie to challenge what the Law Society is doing, the fact that Heller was attacked, Mark Berry was attacked, and then Dallas Brodie's being attacked by the NDP MLAs, the NDP MPs, and even members in her own caucus. And then the leader, who's just an embarrassment, who he doesn't understand that, first of all, the Union of British Columbian Indian Chiefs is not going to appreciate what he's done. They're just going to see it as blood in the water, and they're going to get even more and more aggressive about their bullying and their intimidation. And then the principled people, like myself and anyone who's watching who is being rational about this, they just see him as a coward and a person who's unable to stand on principle. So he is going to fail on both fronts. And I'm not a conservative, so I have no nothing in this game. I have no skin in this game. I don't have any interest. But when I see leaders acting the way he's leading, or lack of leadership, it just shows you how terrible our political system is. And we don't have any left that's pursuing class politics. They're all into identity politics. They're all like Jagmeet Singh, who is just the most horrible politician ever. It's just terrible, and I don't know where it's going. And it's this kind of stuff where people can see the obvious, ridiculous character of what's going on that resulted in the election of Donald Trump in the United States. So people on the left should think about this, is supporting these ridiculous causes like, the whole Kamloops Indian residential school, all the money that's being distributed to these neo-tribal elites, instead of addressing the serious suffering that exists in Indigenous communities. For example, the at least 25% fetal alcohol syndrome rates that exist in these isolated communities, the terrible lack of education, the healthcare problems, the violence, the suicides. Running your ground penetrating radar machine around and paying Kimberly Murray hundreds of thousands of dollars to write ridiculous reports. All the lawyers who are making a killing off of all this, that does nothing to address the terrible social conditions in Indigenous communities. So people should be thinking about that instead of listening to people like Sean Carleton and all these ridiculous politicians. I hope that has shed some light on the James Heller controversy. Thank you very much for listening to this video.